This is my true story. I gave my life to build a farm, working in the fields from sunrise to sunset. I thought my son would honor me, care for me, and remember the sacrifices I made. But instead, he mocked me. One night when I asked for food, he pulled cold scraps out of the trash can and told me to eat. My heart broke in that moment, but I stayed silent. What I did after will shock you. But before I tell you, tell me in comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. And please don't forget to subscribe so more people can hear my story. I spent my whole life in the fields. From the time I was a young man until my hair turned white, the farm was my life. I woke up when the sky was still dark, and I worked until the sun disappeared. My hands were rough, my back bent, my body broken many times over, but I never stopped. The soil was my bread, the land was my home, and every harvest was food for my family. I did not do it for myself. I did it for my son. Every seed I planted, every crop I pulled from the ground, every drop of sweat that fell from my face, it was all for him. I wanted him to live better than I did. I wanted him to eat when he was hungry, sleep when he was tired, and walk with pride knowing his father had built something that would never fade. While I worked, I thought of him. While I saved money, I thought of his future. I gave up rest, gave up comfort, gave up joy, because I believed one day he would look at the farm and see love. I thought he would say, "This land is my father's gift, his sacrifice, his blood in the soil." There were days when the rain destroyed the crops, and I had nothing left for myself. I ate less so he could eat more. There were nights when I came home with blistered hands and aching legs, but I still found the strength to prepare food for him, to check his schoolwork, to make sure he grew up with hope. I wore torn clothes so he could wear new ones. I stayed hungry so he never had to feel what hunger was. When he grew older, I handed him the farm. Not as a gift of paper, not just land and barns, but as a piece of my life. I told myself this would be his inheritance, his honor, his pride. I had tilled the ground with bare hands, broken my body for it, but I believed he would continue it with respect. I believed he would take care of it and remember the man who gave it to him. To me, the farm was never just soil and crops. It was a legacy. It was proof of a lifetime of labor. It was the story of a man who started with nothing but ended with something he could pass on. When I signed the documents giving him control of the farmland, I thought I was passing him more than land. I thought I was passing him dignity. I thought he would honor it, and in honoring it, he would honor me. But I was wrong. The same land that carried my sweat became the land that carried his pride. The same barns that I built with bleeding hands became nothing but buildings for him to brag about. He no longer saw the fields as family pride. He saw them as his empire. And in giving him that control, I thought I had secured my place in his heart. Instead, I had only secured my place as a shadow in his house. I look back now, and I see the mistake clearly. I believed sacrifice would create gratitude. I believed land would create respect. I believed blood in the soil would create love. But my son did not see it that way. To him, the farm was not the story of his father's sacrifice. To him, it was his own kingdom, and in his kingdom, I was not the king. I was not even family. I was just an old man taking up space. I gave him ownership, but I did not give him honor. I gave him land, but I did not give him heart. I gave him a future, but he gave me nothing in return. That is the truth of my sacrifice. Decades of work, a lifetime of pain, all handed over to a son who no longer remembered who made it possible. And in that truth, my heartbreak began. When my son was young, he was soft and kind. He used to run in the fields barefoot, chasing the wind, and every time he laughed, my tired bones felt lighter. I thought all my sacrifice was worth it. I thought he would grow into a man who carried that kindness in his heart. But over time, I saw it fade. Slowly, like the sun going behind clouds, his love disappeared. At first, I told myself it was just age, just him growing up, just the weight of responsibility. But deep inside, I began to see something else, a darkness forming in him. The farm that once felt like family pride to me became something different in his eyes. He did not see the soil as sacrifice. He saw it as his power. He did not see the barns as years of blood and labor. He saw them as his empire. And when he spoke of the farm, he no longer said ours. He said mine. That word cut me more than any blade could. Because the truth was, the farm had been built with my sweat, my pain, my body breaking under the sun and the plow. But in his mouth, it became his alone. He began to treat me differently. At first, it was in small ways. He stopped listening when I gave him advice about the crops, about the seasons, about the land I had worked for decades. He waved his hand as if my words were old and useless. He told me times had changed, that my ways no longer mattered. I stayed quiet, but inside, I knew the land would always remember me, even if my son did not. Then came the sharpness in his tone. He no longer spoke to me as a son to a father. He spoke to me like I was a problem in his way. He told me I was too slow, too weak, too old to matter. His wife joined him. She looked at me with eyes that held no respect, only annoyance. To her, I was not the man who had given them land and shelter. To her, I was just an old mouth to feed. I felt myself shrinking inside the very home I had built. I stopped sitting at the head of the table. I stopped speaking when they spoke. I stopped offering advice. I told myself, maybe if I stayed quiet, they would at least let me live in peace. But peace never came. Each day, my son grew colder. Each day, he looked at me less like a father and more like a shadow. The neighbors still greeted me with respect. They knew my story. They had seen me working through storms, planting when others had given up, harvesting even when my back was too weak to stand straight. They knew it was me who built the farm. But in my son's eyes, all of that was gone. He wanted to erase me. He wanted the story to begin with him. And so, I became invisible in my own home. The farm, which I thought would carry my name with honor, now carried only his pride. He walked through the fields with arrogance, forgetting the hands that cleared those stones, forgetting the nights I slept on the ground to protect the crops, forgetting the hunger I endured so he would never taste it. To him, I was not a father anymore. I was just an old man in the way of his power. I sat many nights alone, wondering where I went wrong. Did I give him too much? Did I shield him too well from struggle? Did I make life so easy for him that he forgot what sacrifice looked like? I had thought love would be enough. I had thought sacrifice would be remembered. But instead, all my giving had turned him blind. He believed he had built this life himself. He believed the land was always his. He believed I was no longer needed. That was the change in my son. From child to man, from kindness to cruelty, from respect to humiliation. And though I still looked at him with the eyes of a father, he no longer looked at me with the eyes of a son. He looked at me as a burden, an obstacle, a shadow he wished would disappear. And soon he would show me just how deep his cruelty could go. The night that broke me came quietly. The day had been long. I was tired, my back ached, my body felt weak, and all I wanted was a simple meal to fill my stomach. I walked slowly to the kitchen, hoping maybe they had left something for me on the table. My son and his wife were already there, eating their food, laughing as if the world belonged only to them. I stood in the doorway, waiting for a moment to ask. Finally, with a voice soft and low, I asked if there was food for me. My son looked at me with eyes I will never forget. They were not the eyes of love, not the eyes of respect, not even the eyes of indifference. They were sharp, cruel, filled with a smirk that cut me before he even spoke. He leaned back in his chair, glanced at his wife, and then stood up. He walked to the trash can, lifted the lid, and pulled out a plate of cold scraps. Old rice, broken bones, bits of bread, food already thrown away. He held it in his hands and looked at me with mockery. "If you're hungry," he said, "eat like the dog you are." My heart stopped. My chest tightened. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. I thought maybe this was some terrible joke. But his wife laughed, covering her mouth as her eyes gleamed with cruelty. And then he placed that plate in front of me, on the floor by the trash can, as though I were no better than the dirt it stood on. I froze. My body would not move. My mind screamed at me to stand up, to shout, to tell him who I was, to remind him of the life I had given for him. But my lips did not open. My hands shook at my sides. My knees felt weak. I stared at that plate of cold garbage, and my heart shattered. I remembered nights when I went to bed hungry so he could eat a warm meal. I remembered winters when I shivered so he could stay under blankets. I remembered working through pain, through storms, through years of suffering, just so he would never know what it felt like to be hungry. And now, the same child I had fed was feeding me trash. My son laughed, and his wife laughed with him. They watched me as if I were a show put on for their amusement. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to sink into the floor. The shame was heavier than my years of labor, heavier than all the burdens I had carried in my life. For the first time, I felt smaller than the soil I once tilled. I bent down, not because I wanted to, but because my body betrayed me. My stomach was empty, my hunger sharp, and my shame crushing. I touched the plate, my fingers trembling. The food was cold, the smell sour, and my heart broke in silence. I pushed it away. I could not do it. I would rather starve than eat from the trash like an animal. Their laughter grew louder when they saw me push it away. To them, my shame was entertainment. To them, my pain was a game. My son looked at me as if he had won some battle, as if he had proven himself above me. He did not see a father anymore. He saw only weakness. That night, I walked slowly back to my room, each step heavy with humiliation. I lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. I could still see the trash can. I could still see the plate. I could still hear the laughter. And as I lay there, my heart no longer just hurt. It hardened. Because in that moment, I understood something very clearly. My son believed I was powerless. My son believed he could humiliate me without consequence. My son believed I had nothing left to give and nothing left to take. But he was wrong. He had forgotten the truth. That truth would become my answer. I sat alone in my room after that night, and the silence was louder than any storm I had ever known. My stomach ached with hunger, but my heart ached even more. The image of that plate of cold scraps from the trash would not leave my mind. It was in my eyes even when I closed them. It was in my ears with their laughter, even when the house was quiet. I had lived through many hard years in my life. Years of poverty, years of storms that destroyed the crops, years when I thought the farm would collapse. But nothing at all, had ever broken me the way my son broke me that night. I lowered my eyes when he placed the food in front of me. I felt my spirit shrink, and I could not look at him. I had been his father once. I had been the man who carried him in my arms, the man who made sure he never went to bed hungry, the man who built an entire life so he would not feel the pain I felt growing up. And yet, in his eyes, I was no longer a father. I was just an old man, a useless body, someone who could be mocked and fed garbage without care. When I pushed that plate away, my heart cracked. I would rather starve than eat from the trash like a dog. But the humiliation stayed. It wrapped around me like chains. I could not fight it. I could not shout it away. I could only sit in the silence, carrying it deep inside me. I thought of the many nights when I had gone without food so he could eat, and now that same sun had given me waste. I thought of the times I stood in the fields under burning sun and freezing rain, working so he would never know hunger, and now he laughed while I sat empty. The same child I had once fed with love was feeding me garbage with cruelty. It felt like the world had turned upside down. I had always believed love between father and son was unbreakable. I had always believed sacrifice would be remembered. I had always believed respect would come naturally when he grew older. But as I sat in that room, I realized I had been wrong. My son had not remembered. He had not respected. He had not loved. Instead, he had turned into a man who could humiliate his father for sport. I stayed quiet in the days that followed. I did not speak of what happened. I did not tell the neighbors. I did not tell relatives. I carried it in silence. But inside, my silence was not weakness anymore. It was weight, heavy, steady, burning. Each time I saw him walk proudly through the farm, each time I saw him eat at the table with arrogance, I remembered the scraps. Each time I heard him laugh with his wife, I remembered the trash. And in that remembering, something inside me began to change. I was heartbroken, but I was also awakening. Because in my silence, I realized a truth my son had forgotten. The farm he bragged about, the land he walked on, the barns he claimed as his empire. They were not his. They were still mine. His arrogance had blinded him. He thought I had nothing left. But in truth, I still had everything. That night of humiliation became my turning point. I stopped expecting respect. I stopped waiting for love. I stopped hoping he would change. My silence turned into resolve. Because if he could give me trash to eat, then I could take away the land he thought was his. If he could strip me of dignity, then I could strip him of pride. If he could laugh at my hunger, then I could leave him with nothing. I kept quiet on the outside, but on the inside, my decision had already begun to form. My son thought he had taken everything from me. He thought by mocking me, by feeding me garbage, by laughing at my hunger, he had proven that I was powerless. But he forgot something important. He forgot that the farm was never truly his. He walked on the land with pride, but the land still carried my name. He boasted about the barns, the fields, the crops, but all of it was still tied to me. He lived with the arrogance of a man who believed the farm belonged to him, but the truth was, he was only living on what I had allowed him to have. When I gave him control of the farm years ago, I did it because I trusted him. I thought he would honor me, respect me, and continue the legacy I had built. I signed papers that let him manage the land, but I never signed away my rights. The deeds, the titles, the ownership, all of it remained under my name. He never asked, never checked, because in his mind it was already his inheritance. He thought one day, when I was gone, everything would simply fall into his hands. That arrogance blinded him. He believed I had nothing left to control. He believed I was just a weak old man who could be tossed aside. But he was wrong. Every night, as I sat alone in my room, I reminded myself of this truth. I still held the power. My son might have mocked me, but I still owned the soil he walked on. My son might have laughed at me, but I still held the pen that could erase his empire. My son might have treated me like a burden, but in reality, I was the foundation he stood on, and without me, that foundation could be pulled away in an instant. I thought about all the years I had worked for that farm. I thought about the mornings when I rose before the sun, when my body was already aching, but I kept going. I thought about the storms I had faced, the crops I had lost, the tears I had shed. I thought about the sweat that soaked into that soil, the blood that fell from my hands when they split from labor. That land was not his empire. It was my life. And though I had let him manage it, I had never let it go. He had forgotten this truth, but I had not. And that was my strength. That was my power. The cruel act he forced upon me, the trash, the laughter, the shame, it did not erase what was written on those deeds. It did not change the ink that carried my name. It did not strip me of the authority I still carried in silence. He had forgotten, but I had remembered, and that memory was enough to give me strength. I sat quietly in the house while he boasted to others about his land. I listened when he bragged about his fields, his barns, his crops, and each time I almost smiled because I knew the truth he had forgotten. He was only a guest in my kingdom. He was only a caretaker of what was still mine. He thought he was master, but he was blind. And in his blindness, he had given me the greatest weapon, the element of surprise. That was the power I still held, not power of strength, not power of youth, not power of loud words or sharp fists. My power was the quiet power of ownership. My power was the silent strength of the pen. My power was the truth that even in my old age, I could still decide the fate of the farm, the fate of the land, the fate of everything he thought belonged to him. And as I carried that truth in my heart, I felt something inside me change. I was no longer only humiliated. I was no longer only broken. I was no longer only a man crushed by shame. I was a man holding fire in silence. My son had forgotten the power I still had, but I had not. And when the time came, I would remind him in a way he would never forget. That night, as I lay in my bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. My son's laughter still rang in my ears. The sight of that plate of scraps from the trash can was still burning in my eyes. My heart was heavy, but for the first time, it was no longer heavy only with pain. It was heavy with resolve. For years, I had stayed silent. For years, I had told myself to endure. For years, I believed that love alone was enough. But that night, I knew love had ended. Respect had ended. Silence had ended. I had reached the point where no father ever wishes to be. I had reached the point of making a choice. I thought about my wife, his mother, and how she would have wept to see her son treat me this way. She had once told me that no matter how hard life became, our boy would grow up to carry our honor. I had believed her. But I knew now she would have cried to see what he had become, a man who mocked his own father and fed him trash like an animal. I thought of her, and my heart broke again. But then I thought of the farm, of the soil, of the barns, of the fields that still carried my name, and in that thought I found strength. I sat up in bed and whispered to myself, no more. No more silence. No more humiliation. No more being treated as nothing. That night, I decided I would act. And my act would not be with fists, not with anger, not with violence. It would be with a pen. The same hands that once tilled the soil, the same hands that once lifted plows and pulled weeds, would now hold a pen and sign away everything my son thought was his. If he could humiliate me with scraps, then I could humiliate him by taking away the very land he built his pride upon. It was not an easy decision. A father does not stop being a father, even after betrayal. A father's heart always carries love, even when it is broken. But I told myself that love had no place left here. Love had been twisted into humiliation. Love had been repaid with cruelty. Love had been turned into trash on a plate. And so, I had to let it go. What I had to carry now was not love, but justice. I made a plan in my mind. I would go to my lawyer. I would show him the deeds, the titles, the papers that proved the land was still mine. I would sell it quietly, carefully, leaving no space for mistake. The buyers would not care about my son. They would care only about the land and the legal rights, and all those rights belonged to me. Once the sale was complete, my son would have nothing left. The fields, the barns, the crops, the soil he walked on with arrogance, all of it would be gone. The more I thought about it, the calmer I felt. My humiliation was no longer just pain. It had become a seed of power. I understood now that silence is not weakness. Silence is waiting. And I had waited long enough. My decision was made. I would take back the farm. I would strip away his arrogance. I would leave him with nothing. That night, I closed my eyes not as a broken man, but as a man with purpose. My son had given me trash to eat, but soon I would give him something worse. The taste of emptiness. The next morning, I woke with a fire inside me that I had not felt in many years. My body was still weak, my hands still shook, and my back still ached from age, but my spirit was no longer bent. I moved through the house quietly. My son barely looked at me, as if I was invisible. He sat at the table bragging about the farm, about his future, about the power he thought he had. I lowered my eyes, said nothing, and walked past him. He believed I was broken. He believed I was powerless. But inside, I was holding a secret, the decision I had made. I dressed myself in my old jacket, took the papers I had kept safe for years, and walked to town. Each step was slow, but each step was heavy with purpose. I went to my lawyer, the man who had helped me guard the deeds and titles through all the years. He looked at me with surprise when I told him what I wanted, but he did not question me. He pulled out the documents, the ownership records, and laid them before me. My son's name was nowhere, only mine. Seeing my name there again reminded me of the truth. The farm had never left me. It was still mine, and now I would use it to restore my dignity. I signed the papers slowly, carefully, pressing my name into the page with steady hands. With each stroke of the pen, I felt lighter. I was not just signing a sale. I was signing away his arrogance. I was signing away his pride. I was signing away the empire he thought was his. The buyers were waiting, men who had been interested in farmland for some time. They cared nothing for my son. They cared only for the land, and the land was mine to sell. The process took hours, but I did not feel tired. I felt stronger with every step. When it was complete, the farm was no longer tied to my son. The fields, the barns, the equipment, the soil itself, all of it was gone from his hands. I had redirected the money into private accounts under my name, secure and hidden from him. He could not touch a single dollar. He could not stop a single step of what I had done. It was all airtight and legal. I walked out of the lawyer's office into the sunlight, and for the first time in many years, I felt free. The farm had been my life's work, and I had given it to him thinking it would bring me honor. But when he fed me garbage, when he stripped me of dignity, I realized the farm was no longer my gift. It had become my weapon, and I had used it. I returned home that evening carrying no papers, no signs of what I had done. My son sat in the living room with his wife, laughing, drinking, careless as always. He did not know that the ground beneath him had already been taken away. He did not know that his barns no longer belonged to him, that his fields were no longer his pride, that his empire had collapsed while he was busy mocking his father. I looked at him once, but I said nothing. My silence was my shield. My silence was my revenge. That night, I lay in my bed and thought of the scraps from the trash can. I thought of his laughter as he forced me to kneel like an animal. But this time, the memory did not crush me. This time, the memory gave me peace. Because now, I had answered him, not with fists, not with shouting, not with anger, but with action. Silent, final, permanent action. The execution of my plan was complete. The farm was gone. The land was sold. The money was mine. My son was about to wake up to a world where he had nothing left. The first signs of the fallout came quickly. Only a few days after I sold the farmland, I heard my son shouting on the phone. His voice carried through the walls of the house, filled with anger and panic. I sat quietly in my chair, not moving, not speaking, but every word reached me. He was arguing with the bank, demanding to know why certain accounts were empty, why payments were not going through, why his credit was being questioned. His wife stood beside him, her face tight with worry. He waved his arms, cursed, and slammed the phone on the table, but no answer could change the truth. The land was no longer his. The fields, the barns, the equipment, all gone. By the end of the week, I watched him pacing the floor like a trapped animal. He went outside to the fields, walked through the soil with wide eyes, and shouted at the workers. But the workers already knew. They had heard the whispers. The new owners had arrived with papers in hand, papers that carried my signature, not his. The land no longer belonged to him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His arrogance, once so loud, was now turning into desperation. The neighbors began to talk. Word spread quickly in the village. People who had once heard him boast about the farm now whispered about how he had lost it. They remembered me, the old man who had built the land with his bare hands. They remembered how I worked until my back bent, how I carried sacks heavier than my body, how I endured storms and droughts to keep the farm alive. And they remembered how my son treated me. They remembered the disrespect, the arrogance, the cruelty. Now they saw him with nothing, and they shook their heads. Some pitied him, some laughed at him, but all of them knew the truth. Pride had destroyed him. I stayed silent. I did not need to explain myself to anyone. My son's downfall spoke louder than any words I could have said. Each day, his face grew darker, his steps more restless. His wife grew bitter. She shouted at him in the evenings, her voice filled with blame. She told him he had ruined everything, that he had been careless, that he had failed. I lay in my bed and listened to their fights. The same house that once echoed with their laughter now shook with their anger. The bills began piling up. Without the farm, there was no income. Without the land, there was no pride. Without the fields, there was no future. His so-called empire had vanished overnight. He had mocked me for being old, for being weak, for being useless. But now he was the one powerless. He had forced me to eat trash from the can, and now he had nothing to eat but shame. I watched him break slowly. The man who once strutted through the village with his head high, now walked with shoulders bent. The friends who once surrounded him disappeared when they realized his wealth was gone. The respect he demanded turned into whispers behind his back. He tried to act strong, tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the truth was written on his face. He had lost everything. For me, it was not joy I felt, but justice. I did not celebrate his downfall. I did not laugh at his misery. I simply sat in silence, carrying the peace of knowing that balance had been restored. He had humiliated me in the worst way, and I had answered not with violence, but with dignity. My pen had been stronger than his pride. Each night, as I lay in my bed, I thought of that trash can. I thought of the cold scraps he had placed in front of me, the way he laughed as if I were nothing. And then I thought of him now, walking through empty fields that no longer belonged to him. That memory gave me peace, because the fallout was complete. My son had given me garbage. I had taken his land. And now, he was the one left with nothing. After the farm was gone, the true aftermath began. My son could no longer hide his downfall. The neighbors spoke in low voices when he passed by. The same people who once praised him for his wealth now shook their heads in disappointment. Some pitied him, but most said what needed to be said, that arrogance never lasts. They remembered the way he treated me, the way he mocked me, and they said aloud that what happened was justice. Relatives came by too, not to support him, but to question him. They asked how the land slipped away, how he let the farm vanish. He had no answers. His pride, once so large, was now crushed under shame. The barns that once stood as symbols of his power were now filled with strangers' equipment. The fields where he once boasted were now plowed by new hands. He would walk to the edge of the land, but he was no longer master there. He was just another man looking in from the outside. The humiliation was public now. Everyone knew he had lost it all. Everyone knew his empire had collapsed overnight. And the sting of that humiliation was worse than hunger. His wife grew colder by the day. She had once laughed with him at my expense. She had once enjoyed the pride of being the wife of a landowner. But when the land was gone, her laughter died. She looked at him with scorn, with anger, with disgust. Their marriage, once filled with arrogance, was now filled with bitterness. They argued loudly at night, their voices carrying through the house. She blamed him for everything, and he could not deny it. His face grew pale, his body thin, his pride broken. I moved through the house in silence. I did not need to speak. I did not need to argue. My justice had already been carried out. The farm was gone from his hands, and nothing could bring it back. He had mocked me once, told me to eat like a dog, fed me trash from the can. But now, he was the one being fed whispers of shame from the village. He was the one left with nothing. Relatives who once praised him turned away. Friends who once gathered around him disappeared. The respect he demanded was replaced by laughter behind his back. Children in the village pointed at him, whispering that he was no longer the son of a farmer, but the son who lost the farm. Every step he took outside was a reminder of what he had lost. Every look from the neighbors was a mirror of his humiliation. And me? I sat quietly, carrying dignity for the first time in many years. I no longer felt like the old man who was forced to bow before a trash can. I no longer felt like the burden he tried to make me believe I was. I felt like the man I once was, the man who had worked the soil, built the farm, and made the land live. My son had tried to erase me, but in the end, it was him who was erased. The land was gone, and with it, his pride vanished. The aftermath was not loud for me. It was quiet. I would eat at my own table, warm food on my plate, and each bite reminded me of the balance restored. I did not need revenge with anger. My revenge was in silence, in action, in patience. I had waited, and I had struck when the time was right. And now the world knew. My son had given me trash to eat, and in return, I had taken everything from him. The farm was no longer his, the pride was no longer his, the respect was no longer his, and the world, the neighbors, the relatives, they all saw it. That was the true aftermath. His empire of arrogance was gone, and all that remained for him was shame. When everything was finished, I disappeared. I packed a small bag, not heavy, not full of things, just enough to carry me through the days ahead. I left quietly, without a word, without a note, without telling anyone where I was going. My son woke up one morning and found me gone, just like he had once taken away my dignity. But this time, it was different. This time, I left with my dignity in my hands. I walked away from the house that was no longer a home, from the son who was no longer a son, from the land that no longer held meaning for me. I settled in a place far from the village, a place where no one knew me, where no one whispered about my humiliation or my revenge. I bought a small house with the money from the land, nothing grand, nothing large, just enough for me to live in peace. I bought a table, and on that table I placed warm food every evening. I ate with dignity, with silence, with peace. Each bite was not just food. Each bite was victory. Each bite reminded me that I was no longer forced to beg, no longer forced to bow, no longer forced to eat garbage from a can. I would sit in that house at night and think of my wife, may her soul rest in peace. I thought of her smile, her voice, her faith in me. I thought of how she believed our son would carry our name with honor. And I thought of how wrong she had been, of how wrong I had been. But then I would look around me, at the quiet home I had made for myself, at the dignity I had reclaimed, and I knew that in the end, I had done what needed to be done. Our son had betrayed us both, but I had answered that betrayal with strength. I did not feel guilt. I did not feel regret. I felt justice. Because he had given me trash to eat, and I had taken the farm he loved most. He had mocked me in my weakness, and I had shown him my strength. He had tried to erase me from his life, and I had erased his empire from under his feet. That was balance. That was justice. The neighbors would still whisper about him, about how the proud son had been left with nothing. The relatives would still shake their heads, saying how shameful it was for a man to lose the land his father built. And my son would still carry the weight of that humiliation for the rest of his life. He would wake each morning and know that the land was gone, that his pride was gone, that his father had left him behind. That was my revenge. That was my justice. And me? I lived my last years in peace, no riches, no empire, no crowds of people praising me. Just peace, just dignity, just the comfort of knowing that I was no longer the man bent before a trash can. I was the man who had risen again. I was the man who had taken back his honor. When my time comes to leave this world, I will not go with shame in my heart. I will not go as the old man who was humiliated. I will go as the father who answered betrayal with strength, who turned silence into power, who turned humiliation into justice. And if anyone ever asks me what I carried with me at the end, I will tell them this. I carried dignity, because he gave me trash to eat, and I took his land and left him with nothing.